Hello and welcome back. In today's video I'll be talking about Labour taking a poll lead over the Tories for the first time since Boris Johnson became Prime Minister. A survey of 55% of voters think Sir Keir Starmer is ready to lead the country and 40% believe his party is equipped to govern. Labour has moved ahead of the Conservative Party for the first time since Boris Johnson became Prime Minister, an opinion poll has indicated. The survey by Opinionum for the Observer newspaper gave Labour a 3-point lead over the Tories, with 42% compared with 39%. It suggests Labour was ahead for the first time since July 2019, when Theresa May's time in office was nearing an end, and that there is more support for the opposition leader Sir Keir Starmer than Mr Johnson. The poll has also found 55% of voters think Sir Keir is ready to lead the country and 40% believe Labour is equipped to form the next government. It is the latest poll that suggests waning public confidence in Mr Johnson's and the wider government's handling of the COVID-19 pandemic. Earlier in the year, 65% of voters surveyed back the government's handling of the coronavirus crisis, but in June, a YouGov poll for Sky News found that the majority of Britons, 51%, believed that the government was handling it poorly. And the latest poll showed that the approval for Johnson's administration's management of the pandemic had dropped to 30%. Sir Keir's poll ratings rose significantly in the first 100 days since becoming Labour leader. A YouGov survey in June found that he was most likely to be compared with Tony Blair by voters, and it has already seen a clean break from Jeremy Corbyn, who led Labour to its worst election defeat in decades in December. Sir Keir's time at the helm has been dominated by COVID-19, over which he has pinned Mr Johnson down on the detail at Prime Minister's questions and argued the government was slow into lockdown, slow on testing and slow on tracing. He has also implemented swift and decision reforms to his party's image, replacing the powerful General Secretary with a more centrist figure, cracking down on anti-Semitism and firing Corbyn loyalist Rebecca Long-Bailey from the shadow cabinet. When he took over the party's leadership from Mr Corbyn in April, Sir Keir told Sky News that he would be different by demonstrating what an effective opposition looks like. He vowed to work with Mr Johnson to do whatever we can to defeat the coronavirus crisis by pulling together and being constructive. The promise not to attempt to score political points over the pandemic was popular among voters, polls suggest, but he has recently become critical of the government's decision-making. Here is a short video about that.
Okay, big announcements on new COVID restrictions yesterday. Different leaders of different nations have gone in different directions. Do you think Boris Johnson went far enough?
Yeah, there are obviously different rules now in England, Scotland and Wales, and one of my criticisms of the Prime Minister is that he hasn't held the four nations together, barely had meetings with the leaders in the devolved administrations, and it would be far better if there was one set of rules across the whole of the United Kingdom.
And just in terms of the other issue, which is if we are living with restrictions for longer, the furlough scheme, you want more support for people if they can't get back to work.
As the government is introducing new health restrictions, it's phasing out economic support. Businesses now, as the result of these new restrictions, are going to be put under huge strain, and you owe it to them to put a support mechanism in place. So the government really should have done that yesterday.
Let's move on to your speech yesterday. You talked about the Prime Minister's character in your speech. You said of Boris Johnson that while he was writing flippant columns about bendy bananas, I was defending victims and prosecuting terrorists. While he was being sacked by a newspaper for making up quotes, I was fighting for justice and the rule of law. They're quite personal attacks. You didn't used to make such personal attacks, and what's changed?
I'm frustrated that just when our nation needs leadership, we've got serial incompetence, and it really matters.
And you've said that a number of times, but it felt like quite a personal attack. Do you personally quite dislike him?
Well, look, I don't choose the opponent I'm up against here.
I'm asking you how you personally feel about him, not about his performance, but do you dislike him? Because it feels to me like you dislike him.
Well, character matters at a time like this. People are looking to the Prime Minister, and they absolutely need the reassurance that he and the government are able to do what's necessary to ensure the infection rate goes down and to do what's necessary to avoid mass unemployment. So at this time, above all else, character matters.
In your speech yesterday, you said he's just not up to the job. So you do think he's a bad leader?
The Prime Minister and the government collectively are guilty, in my view, of serial incompetence. There have been 12 U-turns. Now, I'm quite prepared to accept that a government will make mistakes in a pandemic like this, and 1 or 2 U-turns are probably a sign of a government listening and then changing. But when you've got 12 in a row, the only conclusion is serial incompetence.
And just in that speech, you talked about Wilson, you talked about Blair, you talked about Attlee. You didn't even mention Jeremy Corbyn. You did not even mention him. No name check at all. Are you airbrushing him out of the Labour Party?
The point I was making in my speech is that Labour has only had 3 election winners in the last 75 years, and I want to be the 4th.
But the fact that you didn't mention him suggests to me that you think he's a drag on your success.
I was making a different point. The point was that we can have all the ideas, all the aspirations, we can see that better society we want to be, but if we don't absolutely focus on what's necessary to win an election, we will never ever get to do what we came into politics to do, which is to change the country for the better.
Why didn't you mention him, though?
Because I was focusing on recognising the scale of the defeat, recognising we need to change and listen, and being unrelentingly focused on the seriousness of winning.
And recognise he was a bad leader for Labour?
I was recognising that we need to get from where we are now to winning the next general election.
You didn't have one good thing to say about him in your speech.
Well, I mentioned the 3 Labour leaders who've won elections.
So let's focus on winning and Scotland. You've got a clear strategy when it comes to Boris Johnson and the Conservatives, but what about the SNP? You will never win an election if you can't win Scotland, and go back to Labour's winners. Not since 1955, you'll know this, what I'm about to say, has the Labour Party formed a government with less than 40 seats in Scotland. How many seats do you have in Scotland now?
Well, look, I'll be perfectly open about this. There is no route back for Labour that doesn't run through Scotland.
How many seats
it's
do you
why I
have
was
in Scotland?
It was because, well, we've got 1.
And what do you offer Scottish people that might get you another 39 seats? Will you rule out an independence referendum, as Boris Johnson's done, clearly?
What I was discussing last week in Scotland with Scottish Labour was the importance of rebuilding the economy in Scotland.
What's your position? Do you rule out another referendum in Scotland?
We will be making the argument going into that election next May that this is not the time for another divisive independence referendum in Scotland.
Do you see this?
There are other priorities.
Do you see this, as we talked about when it came to Brexit, as a matter that should have been settled for a generation, not having another referendum in Scotland?
Another divisive referendum is, I think, about the last thing that we need.
In January, you said if the SNP won a majority in the Holyrood election, they would have a mandate for that, for a second referendum. I accept this is a question for Scotland. Do you stand by that principle? I'm not asking you hypotheticals about what happens in May. Do you stand by the principle of what you said in January?
I understand the desire of many people in Scotland to have decisions about them made closer to them, and that is a question for Scotland.
I'm asking you about the principle. An SNP majority gives them a mandate for a referendum. In January, you said that you would accept it's a question for Scotland if the SNP win that majority. Do you, in principle, stand by what you say in January, or do you want to move away from that?
Well, we're going into an election in May where we will all set out our positions, and the Labour Party position will be...
What is the Labour Party position? What you said in January?
What happens beyond that is hypothetical, and
you're dodging the question.
In politics, people say with great certainty what's going to happen, who's going to win, what they're going to do, and what's going to happen.
I'm not asking you what's going to happen. I'm asking you whether you stand by what you said in January when you said they would have a mandate for that. I accept this is a question for Scotland if they win a majority. Do you stand by that?
Well, these issues are questions for Scotland. I do stand by that. I'm setting out the argument that we, the Labour Party, Scottish Labour, will be making between now and next May.
OK, thank you very much.
So just finishing that article, he said, I'm quite prepared to accept that a government will make mistakes in a pandemic like this, and 1 or 2 U-turns are probably a sign of the government listening and then changing, Sir Keir recently told Sky News presenter Kay Burley. But when you've got 12 in a row, the only conclusion is serial incompetence. Our country is better than that. We deserve better. So that's it. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If so, please leave a like and subscribe. As you can see from my previous videos, at the moment I will reply to every single comment, share my opinion. Please share this with family and friends, and I want to create like a feed, a community of people, so that we can start discussing this on in further detail. But please do leave any questions. If you want any particular videos or actually want me to discuss something, I will make that video. At the moment, I am focusing more on directly news, but I will start discussing if that is what you like. So once again, thank you and goodbye.